Hi everyone, we're going to talk about making functions in Python. So a lot of times you'll have code that you want to reuse in multiple places. And instead of doing something like copying and pasting code, which could make your code very long, hard to read, and hard to update if you wanted to change something small in all of those different places, we can use something called a function. So we've already used functions a little bit. We've used the print function, which takes a string and then outputs that value to the screen. We've used functions like lower and upper on strings to make them lowercase or uppercase. We've used the range function, which creates a set of numbers to iterate over. All of those are examples of functions in Python. So we're going to start off by creating a function that takes a number as an argument and returns whether it is odd or even. So to start off with a function in Python, you need to define it first. So you do def, that's the define keyword. It tells Python that you're creating a new function, and then a name for the function. When you name functions, you usually want them to be action words. You want the name to kind of describe what the function does. So we will name our function odd or even because we want it to return odd if it's odd and even if it's even. Now that we have the name, we need to define the arguments that it takes. So that's what goes into the function. So in the print function, we pass it a string or a value to output to the screen. In our functions, we can have anything as input. So in this case, we want to take a number. So you define arguments by putting parentheses after your function name and then writing the names that you want those arguments to have. So these aren't going to be values yet. They're going to be placeholder variables for what will be passed in later when your program actually runs. So you want them to be descriptive names as well. So we'll name this argument number. And then, as with all things in Python, you want that colon at the end of it to signify that we're going into a block. It's always a good idea to have a little comment under the name that says exactly what your function does. So just add a little note. This function returns odd if number is odd, or even if number is even. So now we get to the body of the function. This is what the function will actually do. So I've used a word return in here, which we'll get to in just a minute. But first, let's just make this function print out whether a number is odd or even. So we're going to go back to our modulus test to see if that number mod 2 is 0. Then it's even because it's divisible by 2 without any remainder. Otherwise, it's odd because it has a remainder when divided by 2. So if number %2 equals 0, let's have it print even, and otherwise else print odd. So now you'll notice if I click run, nothing happens. That's because I've defined the function, so it knows what the function is, but I haven't called it yet. I haven't told the program that I want to use the function. It's just like the print function. It's always hanging out in Python whether or not you use it, but unless you actually use it in your program, then nothing's going to happen with it. It's just going to be there. So to call a function, we want to make sure we are not inside that function block anymore. So make sure that it's all the way outside of the indentation. You'll notice that my cursor is now on the same column as where that function is originally defined. And that's telling Python that it's not part of the function anymore, it's separate. So now we can actually use the function, or what's called call the function. So I can use a function just like my print statement, odd or even, and then in parentheses I'm going to pass it the number that I want it to act on. So I'm going to pass it 13. So 13 is odd, so it should print odd, which it does. So if I wanted to now check the number 10, then I don't have to write any more code. I can just use my function that I've already created and just call it again. So you can use functions multiple times without having to change any code or copy and paste any code. So to recap, we've defined the function at the top, given it its name and its argument. So in this case, the name is odd or even, and the argument is number. And then in the body of the code is what the function will actually do with its inputs. So in this case, it just prints even if the number is even and odd if the number is odd. So often we want to be able to pass out a value to use later from the function. Sort of like the range function, it passes out that number that you can those numbers that you can iterate over. So instead of printing something inside the function, we want to return it to use outside the function. And we can do that with the return keyword. So instead of print even, I want to return even. Instead of print odd, I want to return odd. So this will pass out even or odd depending on what the function is. So you'll notice when I run here, nothing happens again. So these are just becoming the strings, even or odd and even, but nothing's happening with that string yet. So let's print it now that it's outside that function. So we can print around your function call. And now it will properly display odd and even again. So in this case, inside the print statement, this evaluates here to the string odd, but it doesn't display anything because we remove those print statements until we print the output. And similarly, this displays even, this returns even, but it doesn't display anything until we use the print statement on it because we remove the print statement from inside the function. So you can have functions that both return values, like this one does, and don't return values, like the previous one did. There are always two parts of using a function. There's defining the function, which is what we did in lines 1 through 9. And then there's actually using the function in the code, which we did in lines 12 and 13. So this is outside the function declaration using the function. We can also have functions that take multiple arguments. So let's create a function. Instead of being odd or even, it's divisible by. So define divisible by. And this function is going to take two arguments. It's going to take the argument number and then the number divisor. And we want to see whether the number is divisible by the divisor. Don't forget the colon at the end to show that we're going into a new block. Again, I'm going to comment what the function does and what it returns. So it'll return true if number is divisible by divisor, and false if it's not. So I'm going to create a variable, divisible, and let's have it be false by default. So now if the number is divisible by the divisor, we want to change this to true. So we have if number percent divisor. Again, this is the mod operation, so it's checking to see if the divisor goes into number an even amount of times. So it should return 0 if it does. Then we want divisible to be true instead. And now after that, we can return divisible. We could have also done this like in the previous problem with two branches of the if statement and with a return in each one. So this is just a different technique on how to structure your program. So again, if I run here, nothing's going to happen because I've defined my function, but I haven't used it yet. We have to go outside the function, so return a couple times and make sure that you have completely deleted to the end. And then this is outside my function. I'm going to use my function. So now I want to be able to use the output of my function to do something else. Let's write a little program that prints number is divisible by divisor if it is divisible and is not divisible by divisor otherwise. So I'm going to have my number, I'll just call it num, and let's start with 15. And I'll call my divisor div is equal to 5. And now I need to actually call my function. So I'm going to make an if statement. If divisible by num div, I can pass in these variables directly to the function and it will replace these placeholder variables inside. So in this case, my number is 15, so this is the same thing as putting 15, comma 5. So I'll just write that in a quick note. Same thing as divisible by 15, 5. Because my number is 15 and div is my divisor is 5. So that's just an example of how you can pass in other variables to functions and use them. So we have is divisible by num div, and we want to print, and we're going to use our string formatting. Our number is divisible by our divisor dot format num comma div. So notice that format is another function. And now we want else. And I'm just going to copy this line because I'm just changing one thing. And then we want to print is not divisible by. So sorry, the screen is jumping around a little bit strangely. Okay. So now it should print 15 is divisible by 5 if all went well. And it does. Always nice when things work. And we can try this with a different number. So let's try 16. So now 16 is not divisible by 5. Our function is performing correctly. So I will post this trinket underneath the video for you to take a closer look at if you want to refer back to it later.